Welcome to Season 3 of Adapt, Climate Change and the Built Environment, where we interview professionals across the private and public sectors to discuss adapting the built environment to a changing climate. We believe that ensuring climate adaptation to extreme weather and evolving climate patterns needs us to re-examine what it takes to make our buildings, infrastructure, and communities resilient and adaptable so that our society can continue to thrive for years and decades to come. And with that, let's get started.
Hi, Monika.
Hi, Jessica.
Today we talked to Chuck Chaitovitz, Vice President for Environmental Affairs and Sustainability at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. For over 25 years before he joined the Chamber, he specialized in environmental and energy issues, working with companies on strategies to improve their bottom line and competitive positioning. Now, since he's been at the Chamber, he's launched an environment and sustainability capability to foster unique partnerships among the private sector, government, and civil society organizations. And we talked to him about that. He calls them, I think, his, uncommon bedfellows. And so we have a great conversation about his work there, and he works with members of the Chamber to support company leadership on sustainability, doing, Monika, what you and I love best, building the business case and enabling conditions through common sense public policies and the actions of member companies to address the sustainability and resiliency issues that you and I talk about.
We discussed a lot of the benefits to businesses of preparing for climate change by incorporating resilience, and the Chamber and its businesses recognize that too. The challenge, as Chuck alludes to, is that we need all the tools in the toolbox. And it's really important to have strong leadership from the federal government on resilience and pre-disaster mitigation efforts. Extreme weather and natural disasters are getting more frequent and more intense. They're lasting longer. And while we can prevent every tragedy, like the tragedy still unfolding in the Texas Hill Country, which our hearts go out to, we can hopefully minimize the loss of life and destruction of businesses and communities if we accelerate our adaptation and resilience efforts. I'm excited to share this episode with our audience, so let's get to it.
Chuck, thanks so much for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Well, thanks so much first for providing this opportunity. So I started my career on Capitol Hill working for a congressman from South Louisiana, Jimmy Hayes, and I worked for the House Science Committee. And I did that for about 6 years in the mid-90s. And then for about 25 years, I was a consultant, mostly focusing on the commercialization of environmental technologies and building public-private partnerships. And I guess one good example there is I helped launch and was the first executive director for the U.S. Water.
What is that? That sounds like an interesting partnership.
It's a partnership between government, the private sector, and not-for-profits, focused on building the best of U.S. expertise to address global water challenges. So really focus on a lot of the challenges facing the developing world, but we did focus on, how can the broad public and private sector communities come together to help with water security.
Okay, which, just becomes more urgent every day.
Can you tell us about the mission of the Chamber of Commerce?
I appreciate that. So I've been at the Chamber for more than 7 years at this point. The U.S. Chamber is the largest business trade association in the world, representing companies of all sizes and sectors. As the voice of the business community, the Chamber's core purpose is to fight for free enterprise before Congress, the White House, regulatory agencies, and the courts, and the court of public opinion. We also engage with governments around the world. Our largest division is our international division, where we have representatives engaged in every region and every country.
And looking at the website, I do see that the Chamber of Commerce has a web page or a page devoted to climate change, which is obviously great. What are the interests or concerns that the Chamber focuses on with regard to climate change?
So the Chamber is a trade association, so we go where our members go. My boss has long said that we need the technologies, policies, and market signals to unlock the private sector investment in the climate and sustainability space. And so while their tactics may change due to the political cycle, companies are investing for the long term. They can't think out in the 4-year cycle that politics happens, but they're looking in decades. And so they're continuing to invest in and develop the technologies and other innovations needed to solve issues around climate and resilience, and they're needed to address what many view as material risk to their businesses.
Yeah, before we get to like kind of more the built environment, that is something I just want to jump in. I talk to my clients about because I obviously do a lot of just business litigation too. And we talk about obviously climate change can have massive impacts on the supply chain, which we all learned during COVID, how devastating that can be to businesses and ultimately to individuals when you have those disruptions. And I think it was one of last year's guests that talked about, the fact that we've basically had a stable climate as far as temperature range for the past 6 to 10,000 years has actually been one of the reasons why we've been able to develop modern kind of both communities or I guess cities, towns, but also modern businesses. Is you need that stability. Businesses do not like the unknown, right? You can't plan for the long term if you don't know what's going to happen. So that stability that we are now losing is really important in all aspects of business, not just in the built environment.
Well, one of the things that that we focus on is how do companies respond to disasters of all kinds, man-made and natural hazards, and really important that they understand what the risks are to their businesses so they can plan. Only then do they know what the environment's going to be for both their employees and their customers. So really important issue.
Yeah, so exactly on that topic is when we talk about resilience, specifically in the built environment. Is that something that the chamber is interested in?
Yeah, disasters and extreme weather are a material risk to many businesses. If the road or the bridge goes out and employees can't get to work and customers cannot buy the products or services they want, that's a problem. And so there's significant data out there that the majority of small businesses don't even have contingency plans in place. And so what that means is they also are not thinking about the resilience of their buildings. And so really looking at what they can do for their structures is an important issue to think.
The chamber also has a foundation, right? That U.S. Chamber Foundation. And the foundation actually hosted a building resilience conference. Can you tell us a little bit about that conference and like what sort of topics you were discussing?
Yeah, well, that didn't just start this year. The foundation has actually been doing it in partnership with FEMA, SBA, and the Department of Defense for around 15 years. I think this was either the 14th or 15th conference. This was called the Resilience Reset. So ensuring America is ready for the next disaster. That, core to the work that I do. What that means is you need to take the practical steps to develop the policies and the best practices to prepare ahead of the next crisis. And I moderated a discussion on what communities are doing to help build resilience. And we talked about a lot of those best practices and the policies that we need in order to advance those issues.
Can I ask, I mean, especially since you've been doing this for a while now, has there been changes, like even just a growing awareness of the idea of the resilience, the adaptation, and needing to prepare for this? Is there talk about that there are more tools and resources out there?
Well, I think more and more companies are realizing that they need to think ahead, but it's a hard conversation to have. That most folks think, and I think it's indicative in communities because, as you probably know, communities don't have insurance. They don't insure their assets because there's other ways in which they can make sure that those financial returns are protected. And so it really challenging to make the case that you need to invest ahead. And so for as long as I've been at the chamber, we've been talking about the economics of resilience. How do you build the business case? And so that's been a challenge. And, I think we'll certainly talk about it later, but there's been a lot of work on that over the last half decade to 10 years, where there's been more research on, what the return can be on those issues.
And on that specific note, on studies on the ROI from resilience, during this podcast, we talk often about the NIBS mitigation save study, which has a few ROIs on the different hazards, right? The Chamber of Commerce did their own study. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
First of all, we utilized the NIBS study and we built on it for our research that we just completed. Really important to understand that in 2018, and I think it was 2018, you can correct me if I'm wrong, when it came out, but it was really the basis for the Trump administration in the first go around, developing an approach to pre-disaster mitigation. How do you build the case for government investing ahead of the next disaster? Because it's a hard conversation to have. Our new study, which was launched last summer, says that for every dollar invested in pre-disaster mitigation and preparedness projects, there is about $13 in reduced losses and economic savings. while that doesn't mean that losses will be eliminated, but that the impact on the economy, on jobs, on GDP, on income will be reduced. And what that translates into is communities and companies, and as a consequence, people can recover more quickly. And that's really at the heart of making the business case is how do individuals make decisions so that they can both protect their assets, but also save lives. And so that's, and as I mentioned, it's a really hard conversation to have. Business owners and homeowners, frankly, would rather have the dollar today and not wait for that ROI down the road. And so convincing them that they need to, at various interventions in the financial cycle of their investments, need to invest more, that's a hard conversation to have. And so we need all the tools in the toolbox in convincing folks that the business case makes sense.
It's hard to talk about climate change or resiliency or saving lives without referencing the Guadalupe River flooding tragedy that's been occupying a lot of my thoughts lately, just how absolutely tragic it is, and seeing some of the discussions about, the flood warning systems that are too expensive. And Monica and I talk about that a lot. And you see that, I'm sure people who are experts in preventative health talk about the same thing. Like, there's a book that talks about humans are, in my view, too optimistic most of the time, and that sometimes leaves us in a really bad spot, obviously, in a really tragic spot.
I mean, the unfortunate situation is that, and just like, that the Asheville issues as well, the water has no place to go. And so it's a very, the wall of water is heavy, and they've talked about that a lot in the news and in the last few days. It's really heavy. And so to the extent that you're going to see a wall of water coming at you, there's not much that you can do if there isn't a place for it to go that otherwise isn't coming at you. And so really challenging for communities and companies and people to address these issues. And I think what we have to do is take away, what would we do differently if we could plan ahead? Are there things that we can do as a country and as communities to think about what is the next step so we can prevent some of these issues? It's really hard to prevent every tragedy and every issue, but I think, we have to learn from these situations to do better the next time.
Yeah, and plan for the next one. Yes. Just to touch on the mitigation safe study, it was in 2019, so you're really close. We'll put the link to that study as well, and the study by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Perfect. No, I appreciate that.
Yeah. So circling back to something you said earlier, you said that when you're doing these foundation conferences, right? The building conferences, you did it with the SBA. That's the Small Business Administration, right? FEMA, of course, we all know FEMA. But you also mentioned you did it with the DOD. I mean, I think that's interesting. I know, I've certainly heard, and we've talked a little bit, we talked in our first season to people who are responsible for managing like the U.S.'s overseas properties. So I understand to some extent why the DOD is obviously interested in even, resilience of the built environment. But like, I'm kind of curious, why are they at like a Chamber Foundation conference?
Well, I don't know the answer to that because I wasn't. I don't know if I should answer this.
Oh, okay.
But I can surmise that they have certain capability and certain interests in protecting U.S. armed forces from and their facilities from risks.
Yeah.
And so they plan for those things, and they're in the conversation. If you think about how do you make a difference in any issue that you want to, as you think about the national defense strategy is a way in which the company plans for risks going forward. And it's a broad range of things that are discussed in any strategies. It's a good question.
Well, so tell me about other organizations. I know we talked a little bit, but when we first talked about this interview, about the fact that the chamber, like, you're not just working strictly with businesses, right? When you're working on some of these issues, especially in this resiliency climate change space, there's lots of different groups you're working with. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, resilience is one of those issues where all kinds of stakeholders have interests and everyone needs to be at the table. So we work with a coalition of what I call, for lack of a better word, unconventional bedfellows, composed of business, conservation, environment, open space, state and local government groups, where we build a consensus to align around these issues. And while we might not agree on everything, I think there is a lot of consensus and agreement around these resilience issues.
That's interesting. Does the chamber at all take a position on what role state and federal government should play in addressing this climate change related issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always room for improvement in how government at any level engages around policy. Climate is no different than that. It's always better for U.S. business to have federal engagement at the table, so a U.S. perspective is represented. Really important that we think about issues where the government has a role to play, and that everyone is at the table, and so the federal government does play an important convening role there. And they also, I think they also do a lot in terms of risk reduction investments. And that's, I think, the heart of what preparedness means.
And speaking of the federal government, in 2018, under the first Trump administration, and I think it was under a bipartisan budget bill, they passed the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program. That was back in 2018. Were you or was the chamber involved in work on that?
Oh, we were supportive of the language in the Bipartisan Budget Act that created the program. We were one of many groups that supported it under the first Trump administration. And ever since then, we have been advocating on program implementation. How can we better implement, what pre-disaster mitigation investments look like? For instance, one of the big challenges that the BRIC program faced over the last, 4 years of implementation was that sometimes the communities that needed it most couldn't access the grant funding. That's a consequence of a number of things. One of them is the basic premise that the FEMA technical assistance programs are competitive, that everyone can't access them, and you have to compete in order to receive the assistance and the funding to do so. And that presents barriers to certain communities accessing those funding. We did support another piece of legislation that passed called the Community Disaster Resilient Zones Act that had broad bipartisan support, which looked at how do we target funding across the federal government and action across the federal government to both the most vulnerable and the most at-risk communities. I don't know if that kind of a program will continue under this, the new administration. But I would think that because, everyone is really interested in addressing communities at most risk, I think there's a natural conversation that can have where, these are all issues that maybe we change the language where we talk about this, but, at the end of the day, we need the outcomes that are out there for people and communities and businesses that are in them in order to support a growing economy.
Going back to that Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program launched in 2018, it was canceled by President Trump earlier this year, right? And I think you wrote an op-ed about it.
I don't know. I didn't write an op-ed specifically about the cancellation of the BRIC program. I did write a blog and several blogs about the importance of pre-disaster mitigation policy. And we,
Got it.
we were supportive of the program. We think it was a good idea. I think every program and every government agency could use improvement. So I don't doubt that something like that could improve the way in which it was implemented. The other thing that I'll mention is that I don't want to get, bent around the axle about what the name of the program is called or what the program is. I think we really need to focus on those outcomes. So if there is a way in which the current FEMA or other agencies are thinking about preparedness and pre-disaster mitigation and making those investments, I think that that's still progress. And so the chamber, we're happy to work with any agency or stakeholders that have interest in this issue. And to the extent that we can help advance things that where we make progress, I think we're happy.
Speaking of working with people to help advance these issues, does the chamber also work at the state government level? Are you guys talking to states about what they can be doing in these areas?
Well, we mostly focus at the federal level. We do have our Federation of State and Local Chambers, which are advocating at the state and local level. So when we see issues that we track through our members that are impacting in the states, and now you could argue that states are definitely acting in the absence of federal action in many of these issues. You need to keep abreast of these issues to make sure that businesses know what's happening. but also to track things where you can make a difference and point to states where there are important changes that are happening or challenges that are presented to businesses where states may have some regulatory overreach. We think about kind of having that balance. And so we do engage with state and local governments through our state and local chambers. There are a number of trade associations, as you know, in Washington working, representing the interest of state and local officials. And so we work really closely with them. And they're part of our coalition of unconventional bedfellows and among the most active, because when you have a group of counties and cities that are impacted, they care about, how you make these changes and what the changes in federal policy are going to impact how they're able to help their constituents as well.
I was trying to get myself educated on the U.S. Chamber of Commerce prior to this recording, and I figured there could be podcasts or maybe podcast episodes. It turns out state level chambers of commerce have podcasts. And, this is very limited research I did, but it appears that after Hurricane Helene, the Chamber of Commerce from Tennessee was helping the Chamber of Commerce from North Carolina.
Well, our foundation has direct interventions with our chambers and members in the before and in the wake of disasters. And, an example of that is we just had a call with state chamber presidents in advance of hurricane season to say, this is what we're hearing. This is what the policy landscape is. This is what the preparedness landscape is. And so, to look at ways in which we can support them as they look to advance whatever they're going to be able to do to respond, because chambers are somewhat and not to use a pun, but in the eye of the storm. When disasters happen, they really have to be at the table in order to help their members respond.
All right, well, that segues nicely to another question. Speaking of hurricane season and preparedness, there has been a lot of discussion, and there frequently is, about whether FEMA is prepared for hurricane systems or hurricane seasons. And obviously, as climate change supercharges these, I was just reading about how the Gulf of Mexico is getting warmer and warmer and just becoming more and more of a generator for hurricanes as a result of that warm. And, what are your thoughts on, and I don't know if you can tell us what you told your state chambers about the, preparedness, but what are your thoughts on FEMA and how FEMA is being, empowered to address, these disasters?
Well, as mentioned, as a matter of course, agencies should be open to improvements, but a strong federal role is needed. We did send a letter with our coalition up to the Hill. And in that letter, we said that there is a need for a strong federal role, whether it's with FEMA or another agency. We are going to send comments to the House Transportation and Infrastructure discussion draft, open call. This is a staff developed draft talking about elevating FEMA to a cabinet level independent agency. And so that is one option that should be considered. The other thing that is certainly out there is the executive order that's set up the FEMA Reform Council. They just had their second meeting, and any changes that they make recommendations on, Congress is going to have to act. And so we'll have an opportunity to weigh in to see what's going to happen. It's hard to say. I mean, I think there should be a strong federal role. FEMA has a long track record of being successful in some instances and not in others. I think every agency does have opportunities to improve, and so to the extent we can be constructive and work with stakeholders to do that, I think we're happy to be part of that discussion because it's in the business community's interest to do that.
This may be a tangent, Chuck, but there was a couple of years ago a bill proposing a national adaptation plan that even proposed a chief resilience officer. Do you know what the status of that bill is?
That's a great question. The chamber was among, I would say, the leaders of the stakeholder groups advocating for that bill. Its core pieces are having a national resilience strategy, a chief resilience officer of the White House, setting up a stakeholder council so that FEMA and the federal government can have input into a whole of society approach. It also called for things like a clearinghouse of federal information on disaster preparedness grants and response funding. And so I think that those are all things that, in its pieces or together can be helpful. We are working with the co-leads of that, both on the House and the Senate side, to see if we can't get that kind of legislation reintroduced. I'd also point out that in the executive order on state and local preparedness, president's called for a national resilience strategy to be developed at the National Security Council, which I think is that, that's a good approach. The NSC has broad interests across the federal family, and so they do have a role to play there. They did say it was going to be out in 90 days, but it's not out yet. And so, still more to come there. We would love to see these kinds of issues move forward because you need all the tools in the toolbox in order to be prepared and to have effective policy at all levels.
Okay, and just so I'm sure, because we'll put it in the link, the letter I think you're referring to that was sent up is the coalition letter on the 2025 resilience and preparedness priorities.
I can also share once we send the letter to Transportation Infrastructure Committee. I'm happy to share that letter.
Okay, yes, we would love that because I think this is great. I mean, I'm looking at it and obviously, well, first of all, I love the idea of a chief resiliency officer basically at, very high level in the, I don't know if that's cabinet level, but yeah, high up at FEMA or the NSC or something like that, I think is really interesting. I think obviously the incentives and tax credits to incorporate resiliency measures. People always complain about our tax code being very complicated, but the truth is the tax code comes out of it's a way to motivate certain behaviors, right? And de-incentivize other behaviors. And so I'm one of those who at least is fine with, I think that's great. But I also love here that talk about offering public and private technical assistance, increased clarity and greater coordination among state, federal, and private sector resources to help access those pre-disaster mitigation funding. I think that's you go back to, it is often hard. Often the communities who need help the most or the businesses who need help the most are the smaller communities who don't have the resources or maybe the skills kind of in-house, right, to know how to tap into that government funding. And so I love that idea of offering more of that support.
Technical assistance, I think, is a good low-cost way that the government can invest in supporting those that need funding to help prepare. The more that the government can invest ahead, as our report says, the bigger bang for the buck that taxpayers are going to get. It's better for taxpayers ultimately if people are stand on their own 2 feet. Once you get these systems in place, you hope that that the other kinds of investment can be unlocked. And that can be helpful for communities and companies.
Can you tell us, just kind of closing, what the Chamber is working on related to climate change and resilience, anything that we didn't discuss before?
Well, we're working with our colleagues at the Chamber Foundation and Allstate on new research, which we hope will be completed by the end of this summer. I think there's more that is needed, tools in the toolbox in order to build that business case, and anything that we can do in order to support that, we're going to continue, to push on those levers.
Okay, well, I know you can't tell us yet what the results are, obviously, but did you say you're working with Allstate on that?
Yeah, I mean, it was with our foundation and Allstate that we did the preparedness payoff report, which was our research. So this is a kind of a phase 2 of that, and so something that we talked a little bit about at our Business Develops Innovation Conference, and we'll see see what that looks like at the end of the summer. I'm eager to see it and to be able to talk about it.
Yeah, that will be very interesting. And I just love, and Monika and I have talked to lots of people in the insurance industry, right? Because obviously that is an industry that is very concerned about these issues. Obviously, they are worried about being asked to pick up the tab for everything. But as a result, they're also really looking at ways to reduce that risk, right? So that the bills that they're asked to pay aren't as high. So I just thought that was interesting that Allstate's working on this with you.
Well, I mean, it's the more that you can promote pre-disaster mitigation preparedness, the more that assets are insured. I mean, that's I think what we as a country and as a society, we want to be able to protect the things that where we live and work. And so in order to do that, insurance is a useful tool, but if the risk is too high, that makes things really challenging. And so the way to mitigate some of that risk is certainly to have some of these measures in place.
I'm eager to see the results of the study as well. Was there anything, Chuck, that we didn't ask you or you would like to share with our audience or businesses that are listening?
No, I mean, I think that really happy to be here. This is a great discussion and a great opportunity to the extent that we can be helpful, in the policy debate, and also working with our foundation and others on the practical steps that need to be taken. We're happy to work with anybody who is really interested in those issues.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Oh, no, my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Adapt: Climate Change and the Built Environment. We hope you enjoyed this episode and come back to hear more of our conversations with people leading the way and addressing the issues facing the built environment as our climate changes. Please rate, review, and subscribe, and share our podcast with others who may be interested. And if you have any feedback or suggestions for topics or guests for future seasons, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at adaptthebuiltenvironment@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.